It's my pleasure to introduce the Samvera Connect 2020 keynote speaker, Torsten Reimer. As a member of the British Library Strategic Leadership Team, the head of research services is responsible for the contemporary collections and development of our services for researchers, research organizations on-site and online. He oversees the library's content and research services, strategies, contemporary acquisitions, processing of content, including legal deposit, our approach to discovery, long-term access and use of content, as well as related scholarly infrastructures. Torsten is the library's strategic expert for scholarly communications, including open access, research data, and alternative publishing models. Torsten's academic background is in history and digital humanities. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Munich, where he founded the pioneering digital humanities and scholarly communication services. Torsten joined the British Library from the Imperial College London, where he was responsible for the scholarly communication strategy / compliance and development of open access and research data services. Previously, he was a program manager at JESC, focusing on digital infrastructure for research, and co-coordinator at National Digital Research Network based at King's College London. We invite everyone to submit any questions to Torsten via the Q&A button below. We'll try to make sure and get to everyone's questions. Again, it's my pleasure to introduce the Samvera Connect 2020 keynote speaker, Torsten Reimer.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me. I'm hoping that you can now all see the slides. It seems that I wasn't the only one who, when sort of putting a few thoughts together about how to introduce the day, reflected on that it is a shame that we can't all meet in person. After all, I think what I've always enjoyed about particular repository-related conferences and meetings is the buzz and the energy. And that's something that you, to a degree, but never really completely, can replicate virtually. On the other hand, though, I think there's also at least a slight bit of advantage in the current situation, which is for those of you who, like on my end, is now gin o'clock or the time for any kind of refreshing beverage, I hope that you have something in front of you, whether it's a cup of tea, coffee, maybe a cocktail or something else. Partly because it's a nice thing to do, but also because some of the thoughts I want to share are a bit more on the sobering side about the future of open infrastructures and library and knowledge infrastructures more broadly. Although I hope I can balance this with some positive, more directly repository-focused experiences and comments. So I quite like to, as a historian, start in the past. In this case, it's a semi-mythical past, where you could just build something and they would come. And some ways, actually, as far as libraries and other knowledge infrastructures are concerned, that has been quite true. If you, for example, look at the British Library, we built the building, and in fact, we built the building or buildings around a large library collection, and people came. And it's probably true for many libraries or other knowledge infrastructures for a while, that there was something that drew people to them, and still does, which is the library collection. Many larger libraries and also some specialized libraries could be relatively confident for a long time that it's that collection in the building with advice from staff that would draw people, because the collection itself was big, it was a draw. And to an extent, that is still true today, but I would argue that the library collection and content held by other kind of knowledge institutions is somewhat less of relevance today. If you sort of look at this diagram that we sometimes use internally at the British Library, I think there's a shift, because there is now a lot of content beyond the content that we hold. In fact, it's probably fair to say that our collections are shrinking. Pretty much regardless how big you are, how big your repository are, your collection are shrinking in size and relevance in comparison to what else is out there in the internet. So we have to, I think, as a community, move away from the idea that we can meet our user needs purely from our own collection that will sort of address whatever they have. In fact, I would argue the value in what we hold often increasingly now lies in building links and connecting to relevant global context. and other information. I think that's some of certainly a transitional challenge that many knowledge organizations face, but it goes broader in the sense that research has become digital in a level that not all organizations can truly match. It's challenging to do. And one of the areas that's particularly on my mind is the question of discovery. If all the open content lies out there and you can discover it on Google and elsewhere, do you still need a library for some things that for a long time we thought were core parts of what libraries do? Now, we have some concrete evidence of that, and that we've been running for a while a program of user research, and the slide that you see here sort of summarizes some of the things that we've learned by interviewing and running a large online panel of non-users. We learned quite a few things that are helpful for us in terms of how we position our services. I don't want to go into too much detail for this, but one thing, perhaps unsurprisingly, that came out very clearly is Google is the starting point. There will be a few others, but it's not necessarily the library. It's not the library collection. This is not something that is on the mind, certainly of members of the general public. But to a degree, I think it's also in research organizations where that's less the case, because even if it's licensed by the library, many researchers, students, and others don't really recognize that anymore. For them, it's sort of all out there online. And that means, as a wider community, we have, I think, for a while been on a journey where we switch from, certainly in the library and wider GLAM world, from a view that our collection is the answer to everything, to a paradigm that's more focused on providing services. And that is largely, I think, driven by not being any type of services, but open science services. We have seen a similar shift in other industries where, for example, the software industry is now not so much selling you software, but rather software as a service. And we've also seen for a few years now that in open science, open research paradigm, that shift has already given libraries and other knowledge institutions a new role, which is enabling our users to share research openly. And the key infrastructure in this arguably is the repository. So you could say, well, things are changing and the repositories are becoming more important, and that's good news for us as a community. And arguably it is, but some of the success that we've seen, and I'm particularly speaking from a UK perspective here, really has come from a drive for open access and research data management compliance. We've seen a lot more focus and effort that many institutions, even at the higher levels within the institutions, have now put into repositories. And really, in some cases, a remarkable change. When I joined Imperial College, there was something like 300 manuscripts of articles uploaded in the repository a year. 3 years later, with all the mandates coming in, it was something like over 10, going on to 11,000 a year. That's a huge success story for repositories, but it's arguably not necessarily driven by our users really loving the repositories. It's been largely driven by compliance. There's a small and growing number of readers and authors of scholarly content who I think have embraced repositories, but what is still at the heart for them is arguably the publication in a journal, because it gives them an added value that repositories haven't really quite managed to replicate, which is prestige. And that brings me to, I think, a key point is we should be focused on the needs of our users, yet what we're often focused on is building systems. And we've made a lot of progress there, but arguably, if you look at many repositories and the practice of how they are run, they're not quite shiny. There is sort of, the window isn't quite working, the engine sputters a little bit, to sort of stay in that picture. And things aren't always quite in the way how they should be. This is not just my view, it's also something that a couple of years ago came out fairly clearly in consultation with the repositories community that we ran in the UK. That was part of a wider open access coordination group that Universities UK ran. And we set up a working group that I was part of to advise the UK government on what could be done with repositories. And we had input from the repository community in the UK. And partly based on this input, we came up with a list of about 20 challenges that repositories struggle with. I don't want to go through all of them in detail here. I think they will be familiar to most, if not all of you, but there's a lot in there with maintaining custom functionality, concerns about the sustainability of the package, difficulties with integration, concern about preservation functionality, issues with persistent identifiers, lack of skills. Repositories are there. They are successful in a way, but they are arguably in practice often not built on a solid base as you would like them to sit on. Now, the world has moved on somewhat since we've done this, but my feeling certainly is that many, probably all of these challenges are still almost as relevant now as they were a couple of years ago. Now, the working group made a few recommendations, which I don't want to dwell on. They contained a lot about metadata and other areas and user experience. But it also said, maybe there's a way to fix this and run things more efficiently if we set up some kind of national repository solution. I have to say, in some ways, I have a lot of sympathy for that kind of approach. Certainly, I think when all these policies came out in the UK, I thought, well, if funders mandate this, wouldn't it be easy if they just pay for a bit of infrastructure that helps us meet all of these requirements? But arguably, there are quite a few good reasons for why one should be a little bit cautious about it. There's not really been a good track record, I think, for public funders to build monolithic systems that meet all needs. And we are perhaps not quite at the point where we can with confidence say that this would be the one most suitable system. Also, I think systems have improved. It's a lot easier to exchange data and make things happen for which previously you might have wanted a national kind of solution. And then, and this will be a key point later, multi-tenancy is hard. Now, have I since I've been talking about national systems come out and say there shouldn't be any more change? No, that's, I think, not what I'm saying. I think what I would quite like to see is us making use of more platforms that are now out there where we don't have to run institutional repositories ourselves, but rather focus on the value that we can add to our users instead of all of us separately trying to keep our own repository up to scratch. And I think a lot has happened in the market over the last few years with interesting options, both in terms of software and hosting now being available. And I think if we can make progress that way and also progress towards the vision of next generation repositories, then we can probably reap quite a few of the benefits. So having thought about this for a while, I then thought, well, let's maybe see if I can, working with my team, make a bit of a difference by exploring what a repository service could be like that's not just run for one institution, but is shared. And this is the bit that will bring my talk more closely to Samvera and particularly to the Hyku flavor of it. Now, what allowed me to do this was joining the British Library. And the British Library has a strategic vision called Living Knowledge that articulates the ambition to be the most open, creative, innovative institution of its kind in the world. As you've heard earlier, we're having two strategies, one that we've developed from scratch, one that we're refreshing, the service strategy and the content strategy. And to implement those, we're running a change management portfolio that's helpfully called Everything Available. I don't want to talk about this. This is a wider change management that also affects how we run our services in the reading rooms and so on. But part of it is the development of a repository platform. We had the issue, and we still have it to a degree, that we have a large number of sometimes homegrown, elderly platforms that are not quite doing what they should. One example is Ethos, the National eThesis repository. It's really one of our most successful services, but it runs on quite an aging bit of technology, and there are a few others. And we thought, instead of replacing all of them separately, wouldn't it be nice if we had a single sort of layered level of repository services on which we could set up different access repositories on the same software, built into some of the services that we offer, such as digitization, and then backed up by a preservation layer, which, as it so happens, we're also currently redeveloping, refreshing the system that's used for looking after a National Library collection that we share with other libraries in the UK. And as we thought about doing this, we talked to some of our partners and they said, well, if you're developing something like this, maybe our repository could also find a home on that platform. So we had a few partners. We had the need to refresh our own systems, but we also felt that we weren't best placed to develop a repository. So we started the procurement process, and we then appointed Ubiquity Press, who just started moving into offering repository services as our technical partner. We choose as a platform a Ubiquity suggestion, Samvera Hyku, which in this slide sort of briefly described as an open source turnkey repository application that's inherently multi-tenancy. It's based on Hierarchs. I would imagine that those of you in the community who've been around for a while will be relatively familiar with Hierarchs. And Hyku, or based on it, has really been designed to address the issue of multi-tenancy on running separate repositories on the same installation. That's what it made it attractive for us. So we went on with our partners at Ubiquity Press in working in sprints to implement this and a constant feedback loop from our partners who were involved. So our partners in this case were largely organizations that are similar to the British Library in that they are cultural sector organizations in the UK, but usually working internationally, who, amongst other things, like ourselves, conduct our own research. The British Library has several million a year in research income. We are a large set of diverse research projects, and so do many of the others, which means our staff publish research publications, and therefore we need an institutional repository amongst other needs. So we got together with our 5 partners and set out to work. And we've recently launched the shared research repository. What you can see here, and I'm not going to do a full demo, just quickly sort of flashing this up, is the landing page from which you can access all these separate repositories, but you can also search across all of them, and that's what makes it a shared research repository for cultural and heritage organizations, with the view that getting all our content together would be more attractive for users than just having our content sit on separate systems. Each organization has its own repository with its own branding, and the screenshot here you can see some of the content that you can find when you search for repository on the British Library's repository. There might perhaps be something that you'd be interested in, and right at the bottom you will see the architecture review for the Advancing Hyku project that I'll come down to. So this functions as separate repositories, but we also have a shared layer where we all come together with our content. Now, having now launched this as a pilot, what are we going to do with it? In the first instance, we are currently finishing a procurement for the next phase of partnership of hosting and developing it. We're really keen to build better digital preservation capability into the shared repository platform. And we're thinking about a whole other host of advancements that we want to build in. And we're also interested in broadening the scope, and we have in fact been approached by a few organizations that aren't UK cultural sector bodies. So we are open and working up with others, seeing whether there are needs for single repositories, other shared repository clusters, or whichever use case we can help supporting by working in partnership with others. So as a quick note from the sponsor, if this is something you find interesting, then ping us a message at openaccess@bl.uk. But back to what I'm hoping you all will be immediately more interested in. What did we learn? Quite a few things, and arguably many of them aren't perhaps always that surprising. We set up a new team. Our colleagues at Ubiquity just did the same, and that meant there was a lot of energy and excitement in there. But also I think we both had to learn how to become more mature in what is a larger development project than we were maybe used to do in this context. And what for us has been really critical, I think, is bringing in an experienced project manager and really sort of treat this seriously. What's also a bit of a challenge is that dreaded word multi-tenancy, because different people mean different things about it. So for us, being really clear what we wanted to drive on and keep that energy and plan things carefully has been crucial. What we haven't quite cracked yet is developing a business model that balances sustainability and affordability, particularly when you work with partners who have a small budget. We now have a business model, which we'll need to adjust based on how our procurement process goes. But if you're a small organization with not much content, striking that balance isn't easy, because there is a certain fixed cost that you need for running a repository, and we're doing what we can to bring that down to help bring organizations in who maybe otherwise couldn't afford their own repository. We also had really good help from the community, and I would like to give a quick shout out to the Palni and Palsy consortia in the US, who are also developing Hyku, and I think the teams really benefited from this. So it took us a lot of drive to get there, but I think we got quite a bit done. But we also learned quite a bit more about Hyku, in particular about the turnkey. What you see here is lots of enhancements that we've made. In particular around persistent identifiers, and our view certainly with the version of Hyku that we worked was that it needs quite a bit more work before it really becomes turnkey. What really surprised me, I think, it was relatively quick to set it up and fairly easy to set up new repositories. Once some basic configuration was done, there was almost a matter of seconds. Yet on the other hand, lots of things that I sort of expected would maybe work better out of the box weren't quite there, for example, metadata work types. But we've made quite a bit of progress. All the code that's been developed is available open source through Ubiquity's GitHub repository. And we're now making effort to feeding as much of that back into the community. And that, in a way, is probably one of my biggest regrets about the project, that we haven't found a better way to match a really, really fast development turnaround, feeding things back into the community. So we have a bit of catching up to do, but we hope that that work, that effort that we've put in, will not just be available in general, but really fully integrated into the latest versions of Hyku. Now, what have we learned about Hyku? Hyku's definitely grown up quite a bit in the time that we've worked with it. It allowed us to achieve what we set out to do. And the community is growing around it, which is good. But it's still, I think, quite heavily focused geographically on the US and the UK. So we'd like to see that grow and invite and bring more people into the community also, so that we can widen the governance. We found that multi-tenancy is actually really easy to set up, or not. It depends a bit on what you mean by it and how you want to implement it. And I think also it wasn't always as easy to pull some of the exciting Hierarchs developments into Hyku as we assumed. And one area that I think particularly could do with a bit more attention is the user interface and make it look more exciting. And finally, linking it into what has been a key of the repository success, which is helping universities to meet compliance target and linking into reporting systems and so on. That's a key thing, I think, that the more we can add, the more success I think Hyku is going to have. Now, thankfully, we have been given $1 million from the Arcadia Foundation. We, in this case, means the University of Virginia Libraries, Ubiquity Press, and the British Library, to advance Hyku in a project that's called Advancing Hyku, and build many of these things that I've just talked about into it, at least make progress to it. I don't want to say too much about it because you will hear more about this at the conference later. I've included the link here, but just to say this is, at least as far as the British Library contribution in particular is concerned, built around an architectural analysis that we've done that's available from the repository and that focuses on things that we need, including scalability, portability, and so on. One thing that particularly struck me, and I'm not quite sure how far this has been addressed in the latest version of Hyku, we came in with version 1, is that to my surprise, we learned that Hyku is actually not storing data that you load into it, publications, whatever it may be, sort of separate, but rather that in binary form, they go into the database, which is something that I'm an early modern historian. I want things to last at least 500 years because that's what my research did. And the idea to, if a system keels over, having to pull the content that's in binary form in a database out, instead of just having it sitting there somewhere nicely, it's always made me a bit nervous. There are workarounds to do this. But if there's work on the way at the moment in addressing some of this and you know about it, then ping me a message after the talk, because then my weekend will, I think, be more relaxing, one of these concerns that I can take off. It is a really exciting package of software, I think. but there is quite a bit that we can do in the community to make it more useful. Now, we have the boost of compliance. We work a lot to make our systems more useful, and there is a lot more available now than there was a few years ago. So we should all be set for a great success story. In some ways we are, but I think there are some challenges that we face as the wider community if we look sort of about 10 years ahead. And I think one challenge in a way could possibly arise from success. So I would assume that by 2030, that long debate about open access, is it a good thing, how to achieve it, should largely be open. That arguably is something that many in the community have fought for perhaps all our careers long, and it's something quite exciting to look forward to, but it will have some interesting consequences, I think, for some of the organizations and the infrastructures. You might think, oh, this is terrific. We've succeeded and all will be well, and it might be, but it's quite possible that what we do and how we do it in there will change quite a lot. I firmly believe if we go to a model where everything is published open access, we shouldn't just replicate the model that we currently have published in a journal and then put into a repository. And arguably, we are seeing some movements that move, you could argue, away from the institutional repository. Welcome. Probably the leading funder when it comes to open access, has a while ago started Welcome Open Research, where they publish content directly. And I'm increasingly wondering, isn't this something that other funders might also consider? Isn't there something where we might not sort of want to break publishing into different aspects, but see if there isn't an easier, more intuitive way for our users to do this? But if that happens, it's possible that the local repository will become a lot less important. And similarly, we see other services such as Unpaywall, service that I think many of us will use and like. But this is one of the other developments that shows the more their content is open, the more there will be innovators who do new things that maybe we as institutions can't always follow, and the users will go to them and experience our content through them. And that leads into a wider point. I think 15 years ago, you could feasibly go in and knock together your own repository for some basic work. And you can still sort of do this to an extent now, but our users are now expecting a level of user experience that's very difficult for many institutions, even bigger ones, to match. So will we really be most well placed as a community to develop these open science services? Or will there be others? And what does this mean for our role in supporting open science if we can't develop and perhaps even host the technical infrastructures on which it is based? Another interesting thought in that sense is persistent identifiers, so the likes of ORCID, Crossref, DataCite, DOIs. We're thinking quite a lot about this at the British Library for a host of reasons. One is that we are working in the EU-funded Freya project that brings many of the persistent identifier providers together. And arguably, persistent identifiers are really what we need in the repository community. But if you think them through to the point where everything has all the right persistent identifiers, then we'll see a shift in the value of infrastructures. Currently, you can hold pretty much all the data and metadata that you need in your own repository. But the more persistent identifiers there are, the more value will come from it being linked into real time into the systems of these persistent identifier providers, because you can sort of build that knowledge web, that knowledge graph in real terms, which means your local collection of your data will become increasingly meaningless on its own. You rather need what lives somewhere online and lives in the cloud. What we also need to do, though, is in some ways stop thinking about user interfaces for people, but to connecting all these things, we will have to develop more and better user interfaces for software. That's a skill that not all of us have, but it also means that if our infrastructures don't serve our content directly to our users, but indirectly, even if we have the shiniest APIs, we'll become more and more invisible. And that might be a good thing from the user perspective, but it's challenging, I think, if we need to run some services that we find harder to justify because they are invisible. And interestingly, there's another development that will bring many benefits, which is artificial intelligence. but it will also bring many problems, because if we don't have the resource to engage with machine learning, and we have to buy these services in from, say, commercial companies who are running closed services, we don't know how these algorithms work. We don't know what biases are there, who they are biased against or for. And arguably, a key thing about repositories, libraries, and knowledge infrastructures is trust. And I think as more and more of these services move into the cloud and are hosted by others who develop this shiny user experience and who have these fantastic features that we can't replicate, the more we are in danger of losing that trust, because these algorithms will have bias. But if we don't understand them, we can't mitigate against the problems that that brings with it. And interestingly, if you look around, I've sort of a while ago taking the screenshot from Elsevier, you would have thought Elsevier described themselves as a publisher, but they're not doing this anymore. A little while ago, they described themselves as a global information analytics business. Now it's maybe something slightly different. Elsevier isn't unique in this, but we might arguably see that while some of us will have hoped for a shift, and maybe some of the big companies not being also overpowerful in an open science world, we might find that the same organizations that we currently pay to publish our content will later on pay them for the analytics services that they use, but we will perhaps be even more dependent because we understand how subscriptions work. We don't understand how these algorithms work. So how might this new paradigm work out? Well, we could very well see further market concentration that tends to happen in a digital world. Fewer service provider. Our role as institutions providing services on a technical side may be less than what is now. We're probably not going to run our own services, we'll procure our services. So procuring and developing, very different skill set. And we might not actually own our information in the sense that it lives out there in the cloud. We might not be the space where people perhaps go to for discovery and access. And also some of the content management will happen externally. And there's a risk, I think, that our repositories that open their content freely might disappear behind shiny commercial discovery layers that we can't control. And with constant pressure on budgets, it's possible that we'll have fewer staff, but we'll need more highly skilled staff to be able to engage in this environment. And managing that transition is a challenge. Now, having spoken about challenges, I want to wrap up with a few things that are currently happening or that we could do to see that my sometimes maybe slightly dystopian vision is not going to come to pass. Briefly, I want to flag up something that we've just developed in the UK. It's called the Digital Shift Manifesto. It's been set up by a working group for Research Libraries UK, which I had the pleasure to chair, and now sort of chairing the implementation group. We've articulated what we want research libraries to be. I'm not going to talk through this in much detail, but openness, sustainability, being recognized partners, and running diverse, ethically sound service is right at the heart of this. And we recognize that to be able to do this, we need to improve the skills. So we have an implementation plan for what the UK research libraries want to do. I've just taken a snapshot of some of the midterm objectives because I want to highlight one piece of work. It's right at the bottom, and that's something that I want to take a lead on and would like to invite others, which is, I think we need some kind of manifesto or set of requirements that we use for procurement that make sure that whatever systems we buy in help with our goal for openness, transparency, and trust. And so coming to an end, a few things that I would like to postulate we should all do. We should stop thinking so much in systems terms, but rather thinking in terms of the service that we want to deliver and the user value that will come along. I think we should do our best to stop customizing and forking our systems to death, because otherwise we'll again at some point end up in this dilemma that many of us are in. Certainly we are for some services at the British Library. Some things become so customized, updating it to the latest version that would be really helpful, it's just become too expensive. Similarly, I think we should focus on what our core businesses as knowledge organizations, which is running the services for our users, and work together in the way that there are some organizations who are really good at developing or hosting. in the community, and others who have other strengths. And I would always ask myself, are we best placed to develop something, or is there someone else? But whatever we develop, we should make sure that the user is at the heart of it and that we have an engaging user experience, that we set our workflows so up that we can give credit to all the open sources that we use to make them visible to our users. We should all rally around open community infrastructures because they are critical. I think we should develop some kind of principle for how we run procurement. In particular, we need to be absolutely mindful that we don't leave artificial intelligence to black box machines that we can't control, because there will be negative consequences. And finally, certainly from our experience, I say, have a look at Hyku. And with that, I would like to close. And if there are any questions, I think we should have a few minutes.
Thank you, Torsten, for that excellent presentation. It's really thought-provoking. We do have one question from the audience. How will this digital landscape protect the privacy of users, and what can we do now?
That's a very complicated question, I think. In some ways, privacy of users is maybe not my #1 concern, in that the open content is normally intended by the users to be made openly available, and academics normally want to be found. Still, I think we have to make sure that we give them choices and be very transparent about what information we collect from them. I think that is critical. They might not use it, but I think we have a responsibility to give them that choice. The other part that we have to think very carefully about is unintended consequences. You might have an anonymized data set, someone else will have one, but if you throw them together and you have the right algorithms, you can suddenly work out who is who in that data set. That's something that I think we as a library community alone can't solve, but we should work very closely with researchers across the world who are looking into data analytics and others to understand what we can do for data sharing and how we can advise users in our organizations what they need to keep in mind, because just because your data set is anonymized does not mean that if you throw it in the internet, it will stay that way. That's, I think, a quick response, but I appreciate I haven't really done this full justice.
Thank you. Another question. What do you see as the major challenges for libraries to adopt open source infrastructure versus commercial infrastructure?
Well, a key thing is the commercial infrastructure will often come in a way that's easier to consume and may look shinier, easier to sell. I mean, I've seen cases in universities where a commercial vendor came, demonstrated to the university leadership, it all looked very good, a contract was signed, and the library wasn't involved. The library could have pointed out that there might be a better alternative. And by the way, to be clear, I don't want to come across as saying I dislike commercial providers. I absolutely don't. We work with quite a few of them. I'd like them to work openly. So I think what we need to do is we need to nourish those in the community who deliver services based on open source, because not every institution can run their own. And we should strengthen community-based service providers or any commercial entity that provides services. I think a lot of how we can do this is through writing this into procurement, but we also need to raise awareness with, say, university leaderships and those who make the decisions inside and outside of libraries, why we want openness and what it's good for, and where it's really important to fight for a level of openness.
Thank you. If anybody has any other questions they want to submit, we've got 3 more minutes. Wait a second. I have one question if there's nothing else. All right. So one question I have is, many academic libraries in the US are decentralized. What advice and suggestions would you provide organizations with limited budgets and to help better coordinate projects with members in the community?
I mean, that's not an easy thing to do, in the sense that it always sounds very good. We'll just do a community project, but community projects need a lot of work. And I think for ours in particular, would like to credit the repository team at the British Library, because developing a shared project is often also a hand-holding project where you maybe need to bring others along who aren't quite as advanced as you, or you might want to slow down a few who are too advanced for the community. So community projects will need a level of effort. I don't think there's any way of getting around it. What I found key is be clear what your challenge is, and then see what other institutions might have a similar challenge. They might not necessarily be the next door institution that you talk to. They might be further away, but arguably that's less of a hindrance at the moment. So I would try and find, for particular problems, others that have a similar challenge and urgent pressure. And another experience that I've made with community projects is some community projects take a lot of time of defining membership and thinking about what criteria do we have. I've always found the most important criterion for picking others to come into a community is, are they willing and able to contribute something? So planning is really important. Plan what you want, but maybe don't plan too much about how you will organize your community, and rather find people who have a similar problem and who are willing and able to contribute. That's, I think, the best advice I can give in a minute.
Thank you, Torsten. Again, we have one more minute if there's any other questions. All right. Torsten, I want to extend my thanks and the thanks of the Samvera community for taking time today to present to us. It's a wonderful presentation, and just want to extend my gratitude and thanks.
Not at all. I'd like to say thank you very much for having me. And also, I think in general, we couldn't have done our shared research repository if there hadn't been people working on all these bits for months, years in their careers. So thank you all for the effort that went into that, helped us launch this. And I'm hoping that we can keep playing an active and hopefully also more active role in advancing our common goals. So thank you very much for having me, and look forward to an exciting conference.
Thank you, Torsten.